Welcome to the Mind and Crip Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam Peace and Amy Patton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for mad and crip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode.
Well, welcome this afternoon to the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. We're so happy that you've joined us. And today we have two guests that are contributors to our spring issue of the journal. And so we want to welcome Steve and Beth Anne. And so welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Great to be here.
And we wondered if you might introduce yourself. So name, pronouns, work, where you live and work, and your connection to the journal. So maybe words, and a visual description of yourself. So maybe Beth Anne can start us off.
Great. Yeah, my name is Beth Anne Fisher. She, they pronouns are great. I live about an hour west of Toronto and I work in Toronto. I'm a PhD candidate at Emmanuel College, Toronto School of Theology. And I'm also currently the spiritual and community life coordinator at Emmanuel College, which has been a great job for me as I take a break from my PhD. I've been on a leave of absence for this school year, which was much needed after a couple of really intense years. So that's kind of my locatedness. My connection to mental health and disability, this is hard to be brief. I'll say for myself, I've been diagnosed with depression and PTSD. And yeah, so I live with those. PTSD, I would say, is not as much present in my life on an ongoing basis, but does come up time to time. And my connection to the journal is knowing Amy and Miriam from school, and I think starting the conversation with Amy maybe back when we started our PhD in 2017, 2018, talking about how there was nowhere that was talking about theology and mental health. And so we started those conversations, 4 or 5 years ago. And so I'm thrilled to see that the two of you have taken the initiative to create this beautiful space. And what I look like. So you can't tell from the video, but I am a tall femme person. I have short curly hair, blue eyes. I have a nose piercing and some freckles that are mostly gone because it's been winter for so long. and I'm wearing a knit kind of gray, black and white sweater and a necklace. And that is what I look like. And I'm sitting in a space that has sun coming directly into me, and then behind is really shadowed, which I really like. I really like that it's so bright where I am, and then the background, it just kind of fades. Unlike Steve, I don't have a 1,000 books on the shelves, but I'll leave that for you to describe, Steve.
Thank you so much, Beth Anne. Yeah, Steve, tell us about yourself.
Well, my name is Steve Bedard, and pronouns are he and him. I am in Brookfield, Nova Scotia. Brookfield, it's not a city, it's not a town, it's not even technically a village. It's more just a rural community. We have one stoplight in the whole place, but it's a beautiful area that we have just moved here at the end of January, and I am co-pastor with my wife of Brookfield Baptist Church, but we're originally from Ontario. In terms of my my interest in disabilities, a big part of that is my two oldest children both have autism, and that's really kind of shaped our life. I knew nothing really about disabilities before then, and they have been a complete seminary education by themselves, some of the best and most graceful teachers that I've ever had. And then a little bit later on from that, actually I say a little bit later, but actually really a couple decades later, I found out that I had autism myself. So that gave another aspect to it. I am a graduate of Acadia Divinity College, which I have a Doctor of Ministry degree, and I did my thesis on small churches and disability ministry. And so basically I've always been in small churches. I'm in a very small church right now. And I know a lot of churches tend to equate disability ministry with programming and needing a large budget. And I wanted to look more at what is it that small congregations can do to be both welcoming and inclusive of people with all disabilities. So that's kind of where my interest is. In terms of my connection with the journal, I've met Miriam once, but I don't really know either of the editors at all, but I had seen online the start of this journal, and I thought this is exactly what we need, something that is finding that intersection with mental illness and disabilities and theology, and looking at how it all comes together, and having a sort of a wide range of topics within that to look at. And when I saw that, I thought that this is definitely something that I was interested in. So I was so thankful to be able to have one of my articles included. In terms of what I look like, I am bald with a mostly white beard, blue glasses, and I am in the office that I share with my wife, with a bookshelf of books that are very heavy to move around, but I'm thankful for them. And it's a nice sunny room that I'm in. Thank you for letting me be a part of the podcast.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for those awesome introductions. And we were saying before we started recording how jealous we are, Steve, of all of your books. Like, that's like my dream, to have a library like that. So that's awesome. So let's get into it. What we usually do on the podcast is send questions in advance to our guests so that they can have a think about sort of the direction we're thinking of taking. And so for today, the first question that we had sent to both of you was regarding your diagnoses. So Beth Anne and Stephen, you both write that you have received diagnoses. So we were interested to hear how the church has been supportive to you as you have navigated your journeys with these diagnoses. And we were also interested to know, in what ways have you found the church to be unsupportive? So Beth Anne, I think I would invite you to begin if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So as I was thinking about this question, I think for me, I would differentiate between the church as a system or as an institution and the church as individuals with whom I share faith. Because I would say the church as an institution has not necessarily been particularly helpful. There have been pockets of it. But for example, well, this was, I want to say that the expectations we have on people, the institutions often don't take into consideration what it might mean to live with a mental health diagnosis. And so for me, at the time that I received my diagnoses, I was between church communities. I had recently moved cities, so I didn't have a space of my own. So first of all, just living with depression, which is such an energy suck, as well as having PTSD that was, and some of it was actually quite closely tied to experiences that were connected to church, closely connected to church for me. So first of all, to try and find a space or to even begin thinking about looking for a community to belong to is like such an overwhelming experience. And then once I started going, I did find a little community, and I would go about 5 minutes after the service started, and I would leave about 5 minutes before it ended in the last hymn, because I had no capacity for the kind of socializing or the meeting new people and all of this. And I was at a place too where I was like, I don't know how to tell people what's happening in my life. That like, I've gotten myself out of bed and I've come here today, but I don't want to talk about what's happening in my life at all. And so I think the ways that we're expected to socialize in a church context, and I wonder if this connects in a bit with some of the things, Steve, that you might have experienced and talk about with your family, but the socialization expectations were really difficult for me. And then secondly, having to rename and explain to people the trauma experiences that I had had and why things that they were asking of me were things I couldn't do, or even why they might need to broaden their understanding of what it looked like for me to be involved for a time, or there's different pieces of just having to kind of say it over and over, or having to say again, oh, well, actually, that's actually really triggering for me. I don't know if I can be in that space or do that thing. At the same time, there have been people who have been so wonderful. And I think for me, one of the reasons that drew me to the church that I belong to now is because there were two psychotherapists. I learned early on there were two psychotherapists in the church. And I thought, oh, psychotherapists will understand. And psychotherapists, I feel like they'll get some of the shorthand. So if I say something about having depression or like navigating PTSD, that instantly their expectations of me would be more expansive. So for me, yeah, that really helped create a space of safety while I was, I want to say, kind of stabilizing in my well-being.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much for sharing. And would you be comfortable telling us a little bit about the ways the church has been unsupportive?
Sure. So one thing that comes to mind, and this is actually previous to receiving a diagnosis, but was certainly when I want to say when, and I talk about in my piece that's in the journal this month about my life falling apart. And so when I was in the midst of that life falling apart, one of the things that was particularly unhelpful was being promised care that I didn't receive. So I was a part of a church. This was before the move. I was part of a church where the pastor, the minister of the community, was fabulous, and they knew what was happening in my life, and they were extremely supportive. And they had connected with someone else who had basically said, give me her name and number, I'll call them, I'll offer some support to them because of the context of what was happening. And that person never called me. And I went back to my pastor and I said, I never heard from them. And they were really surprised, and they said, okay, well, I'm talking to them again, I'll reiterate. And they reiterated a second time, and I still never heard from them. And so I think that was really harmful to me, to be told this person is going to care for you or is going to offer you a connection, and never have that. And especially to know that someone else was trying to support me, and it wasn't their fault. The minister at my community was really, they were doing the right things. They were helping me connect. And it was someone else within the system who just never followed up. So I think that when we offer care, or when we commit to caring for someone who is in a place of mental distress or mental health struggle, it's so important that we follow through and we don't leave it on them to have to do the work of reaching out, because the capacity just isn't there.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing. And that's such a good point. That's really shitty. I'm sorry that happened. So thank you so much for sharing. And Steve, I'm wondering if you would like to share with us about how the church has been supportive to you.
Sure. And if it's okay, I'd like to maybe look at it in two different ways. One is my own diagnosis, and then that of my children, because those are very different experiences. In terms of myself, my congregation actually doesn't even know that I have autism. It just has never come up. And part of it is because I began ministry without knowing about that. And I've just been pastoring and doing my thing, maybe in kind of a quirky way, but I just thought that was a Steve thing as opposed to anything else. And later on found out why I do some of the things I do. And this is something I wrestle with, because I know that if I talk about it a lot in terms of like from the pulpit, that there are going to be people who are going to be challenged by that. I actually just did a presentation at the Canadian Autism Leadership Symposium, and there I presented a paper about autistic people in caring professions. And the assumption is that the stereotype is that people with autism lack empathy. So how could a person with autism possibly help someone who's struggling through any particular life circumstance? They're just not going to care about that. That's why people will talk about autistic people are great in the technology field, and they're great at programming, and as long as it's not a people job, then they're okay. But as soon as they have to deal with people, then there's going to be a big struggle. So that's the assumption that people have, and that's exhausting to work through that. So when it comes up in conversation, I share it, but I don't advertise it from the pulpit, because I just want to be known as I am without having to deny it. I'm sure there are autistic people who would not be happy with that decision, but that's where we're at right at the moment. So that actually gives you both that gives you the negative side as well. In terms of my children, there was a lot of compassion when they received their diagnoses, but a lot of compassion mixed with pity. And we had a lot of people, again, unhelpful stereotypes. April is supposed to be autism awareness. It's now autism acceptance. And I'm not sure that people are any more aware or accepting of autism. They still have very unhelpful stereotypes. So we had one person in the congregation said to me, I feel so bad for you that you can't have any emotional relationship with your children because of their autism. I'm like, pardon? Where are you getting this from? Our children are very empathetic to the point where that's a challenge for them to manage how they are receiving emotions from other people. But also they are very affectionate, very emotional, hugging, everything else. They'll share that they love us and the whole bit. So there's a lot of misunderstandings there, but it's been generally positive in the sense that people have cared and wanted to be supportive as much as they can. We've had times where people have just said, we're providing childcare for you. Get out, go on a date, go away for the weekend or whatever, and provided practical support without necessarily understanding fully what autism was. They just knew that there was a room to help. And so we have found congregations to be very good in that. We were attending a church where our son in the middle of a sermon said, just kill me now. He just said quite loudly. And we didn't think it was funny at the time because we just didn't know how people would react. But the church was very accepting. And we had a pastor who was excellent, who understood what was going on, and would even say when he would make noise during the service to say, isn't it great that everyone is welcome here? And which I suspect he was kind of confronting maybe some of the dirty looks that were coming our way. And so that's kind of where we've been at for that. So it's been a mix of good and bad, although always from a well-meaning perspective, even when they've not been as good. And sometimes that makes it harder, actually, is when they're trying to be good and just give very unhelpful advice or suggestions or whatever. When you're trying to navigate all of the services that we required, it just was always exhausting to have to navigate that at church as well.
Thank you. We're all not into the unhelpful, unsolicited advice. Thank you both for sharing the gifts, the graces, and the struggles of living in community. And now we'll turn to Beth Anne for a moment, and we love your piece. We wondered if you might share a little more about finding God in the pill, and we wondered too about the ritual of pill taking, what that means for you.
I think that the first time that I said I found God in the pill was when I was talking to my spiritual director, which I talk about in my piece. And I said it and I felt like, oh no, have I just like committed a heresy to say that like that it wasn't just a gift of God, but that there was something of God in this. And I think for me, that it was a profound realization that this tiny pill could enable me to encounter God again. And so it is a gift that this chemical, this tiny piece of chemical, can open up my spiritual life in the way that it did. And so I can understand that some people may feel uncomfortable with me saying that like God was in that pill, and maybe more comfortable saying that it was a gift that enabled me to encounter God. Sorry, but I think, and this is where the language of the Eucharist became really meaningful to me because it's something of a mystery. You know, what is it in the Eucharist or in communion? What is happening there? Is it symbol? Is it strictly a sign, or is there something, is there substance to it, if you will? And so I think for me, it was the same way of asking, where is God in the Eucharist? Where is God in this little pill? In the way that it is something that I need, something that I depend on, and something that really changes my experience of faith and my experience of the divine. And without it, it quickly becomes apparent that something is missing. And I think that helps me understand the Eucharist in a new way too, because I was raised in a tradition, I was raised Baptist, and in the tradition where it was purely symbolic. And somewhere along the line, as I've shifted denominations, somewhere along the line, it became something so important to me. And this was again before I'd received a diagnosis or started medication. And I found myself going to church for Eucharist, for the communion. And when I made this move in the middle of all that was happening in my life, I went to a couple of different churches, and there was one church I went to when I realized they didn't have communion every week. I thought, why am I even coming? I don't want to come if I'm not going to get communion. And I know it's not that way for everybody, but there was something for me around saying, I need this. And I need to be sustained by something outside of me. And so that the spirituality of that and the psychology of that, or the, you know, kind of came together for me in this experience and this recognition that I actually do depend on something outside of me. And especially having tried twice now to decide, I twice decided that I was going to go off of my antidepressant. And after going back on it the second time, really saying, like, if I need this for the rest of my life, that's okay. And there's no shame in that. And there's maybe, yeah, something sacred in recognizing my limits. I think as someone who is able-bodied, it can be very easy to push myself, to push myself and to try and pretend I don't have limits. And so this act of taking a pill is a recognition and an acceptance of my limits. And I think in the same way, the Eucharist is a recognition and an acceptance of my limits as a human, and that I need something bigger and something beyond me to sustain me. And I need it more than once. It's not just a one and done deal. And it's okay that I keep needing it, because that's part of the reality of being a human. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. Thanks so much for sharing. And it's interesting, like this, as I've been reading more about people's experiences of medication taking and how they're thinking about it theologically, the ritual aspect seems to come up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really fascinating way to think about it. So
yeah, I was just gonna say, it's interesting because I'm not always, perfectly mindful when I take it. I often just kind of pop it back in the morning with some water. But when I do stop and think about it, it's there. And also when I participate in the Eucharist now, this act of, it's like the two interact with each other for me now. So participating in the Eucharist brings to mind the fact that I have this mini thing happening every day. And then often when I am taking my medication, if I stop and pause and think about it, or if I forget to take it first thing, and then I think later on, oh, I haven't done that yet, there's that same need and that anchoring that it really functions for me.
yeah, that's so interesting. I think we're gonna have a few other people on the podcast coming up who may have like a very different experience of their ritual pill taking.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's been a real struggle for them. So I'm really interested to hear how they're gonna like add to this conversation that we're having. So thank you so much for sharing. And so Steve, The next question is for you. So in the piece that you wrote for us, you argue that incarnational faith calls us to follow Jesus in our embodiment, not only in words. So how do you imagine churches putting this into practice in worship or pastoral care settings?
Well, this idea came out of my experience with my children who are minimally verbal, and it was at the beginning our focus was completely on making sure that they would become verbal. We wanted to have verbal communication with them. We wanted to hear the words. We wanted them to say that they love us. We wanted to be able to hear what is going on in their lives, what do they like, what are they scared of, and all of those things. And back in that time, it was so important to us that we would have done anything to give them get them to that place. And in fact, they were in a therapy that we would not support now, but at the time we did, because we were so desperate for that. And what I see in the concept of Jesus appearing and the Word becoming flesh, that really made me think about how we do church, which is often focused on the words. Almost every service is we're singing hymns, and we have hymn books with the words. We have scripture passages that are read, prayers that are spoken, and everything seems to focus in a verbal way. So how do we include people who don't necessarily communicate primarily in a verbal way? This is really hard, because traditionally that's been the complete focus, but it doesn't have to be that way. And there always has been nonverbal ways of worshiping, of having discipleship, of just being present. That is something that is available. So, for example, one Sunday, we're one of those churches that has communion once a month, and our son, both our children with autism live in group homes, so we don't have them with us at church on a regular basis anymore. But our son was with us because he was having a weekend visit, and we totally forgot that it was Communion Sunday, and we never discussed well, my wife and I never discussed, well, what are we doing about communion? He's not been baptized. Not that that's necessarily a problem for us theologically, but we've never had a verbal conversation with him in terms of where his faith is at. And I'm not overly strict in rules and that, but it was just that moment of uncertainty, and where I'm having this internal conversation while I'm leading the church in communion, because that's when I realized what this is happening. And I was able to really see my son as he took the bread and he took the cup. In our tradition, we pass them around the pews rather than having people come up to the front. And I could see in his eyes, he was present in a way that he's not normally present, not just in church, but in general when he's around us. He was giving me eye contact, not because I was asking for it, but because he just wanted to. And he was participating probably in a way that I don't see most people participate in communion. He really was taking it serious, because there's been many times I've taken the bread and the cup because it's that point in the service and without having thought about it. And he was present in that. And my wife told me that she saw him start to well up in his eyes, and not the sad crying that we sometimes see, but he was moved emotionally in a way that we had never been able to see before. And so that was, so communion definitely is a big part of how that can happen. And there are so many other traditions a part of Christian worship beyond just expressing our faith verbally that we can pull back on and find out what is available, what physical ways, things to hold on to touch, to smell, to taste, to do all of those things. There are ways to do that. In terms of pastoral care setting, it also includes the ministry of presence. I'm also a chaplain in addition to being a pastor. And a big part of what I do is just being present with people. And at first I thought, this is a waste of time. I can't believe I'm being paid just to be present. And yet I saw over time that making a difference. I didn't necessarily have to have a verbal communication with people. And these are people perfectly able to have that kind of communication, but just being physically present with them seemed to be making a difference beyond what I fully understood. So I think it just comes down to being aware that there are more tools in our toolbox than just speaking words and expecting people to speak words back to us. That there's a lot more that is going on. And the church does have traditions that reach out to these ways of engaging our other senses.
Thank you so much. If that's really interesting to remember. I know we've been teaching on Zoom the past 2 years, and how important it has been to remember that we are bodies. We are not just heads on a computer screen, and that matters as people of faith. So thank you. We've come to our favorite part in the episode where we get to listen to you two talk to each other about your work, and we wondered if there was any questions or comments that struck you about each other's work. So Beth Anne, maybe I see you nodding, so
I am
maybe
nodding.
you can take it away.
Yeah, for sure. Even as I'm sitting here listening, I have some more thoughts and questions, but I'll start by saying thank you so much for your piece, Steve. I sat down to read it, and I read the abstract, and I immediately went, nope, can't read it right now. I'm going to start crying. And I knew just from the abstract, I was like, oh, this is a good word. And so I left it for a couple of days, and then I came back when I had a bit more space to sit with it. And I was so struck by the central thought of how being the word was insufficient. And yet in our embodied experience, we so often prioritize that verbal communication over the embodied. And yeah, so I really appreciated that. Pointing that out as someone who highly values clear communication. I've been thinking a lot about how, and again, someone who's been teaching and online for a couple of years now, valuing verbal, and yet also recognizing how limited it is. And I very briefly, several years ago, I briefly was involved in offering support to a young person who was minimally verbal and had autism. And their communication of joy and distress was so clear. And I remember their parent commenting, wow, she really likes you, and how that was communicated despite her inability to use words for her communication. And then it got me thinking about how one of the things that I valued about that was I always knew exactly where she stood. There wasn't confusion. There wasn't that mismatch that often happens between our words and our other embodied communication. And I think for those of us who are fluent in verbal communication, we often end up saying things that aren't actually congruent with the rest of our communication and send mixed signals to one another. And so I was thinking about how the gift of communicating with people who are minimally verbal, in part, is it takes away that kind of confusion, and also it values honesty and integrity. There's no space for deception in the same way that we often, almost always, function in a realm of a certain amount of deception, you know. So that was something that kind of my mind went to. And then the other thing I wanted to say quickly was from something that you said just today about participating in nonverbal ways in worship through holding something or smells or whatnot. And in my experiences, and especially when my depression and my PTSD were quite acute, I felt for the first time in my life that words failed me, that verbal communication was insufficient, and that I couldn't participate verbally in church. I might tear up saying this, that I couldn't sing the songs, I couldn't say the things, and yet I wanted to be there. And it's interesting that you mentioned something to hold, because I would often bring something to hold, or I would just sit and receive the sounds or listen. And I know that I was often seen as not participating because I wasn't singing the words, because I wasn't verbal. And that's really hard when you're in a space. And so I can only imagine how it would be to have that be the consistent experience, that people assume you're not engaged, people assume you're not connected, people assume you're disrespectful, simply because you're not using words in the way that they expect you to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those are a few of the things that really stood out to me. And I also was profoundly moved by the story of your son at communion. What a gift. What a just a beautiful moment. And a reminder of how God is not limited to being the word, and the embodiment of our lives is so much more than whether someone can make a profession of faith or not.
Well, thank you for that. And as you're talking there, it actually reminded me of my previous church. We had a young man, pretty severe mental illness, and unfortunately, he found the only medication that worked for him was heroin. That was what he would try to use, the minimal amount, but that was the only thing that he would find some relief from. And ultimately, he died of an overdose, which was very sad. But he was a part of our church for a long time, although many people didn't know that because he couldn't necessarily participate in worship on a Sunday morning. What he would sometimes do is he would come in and he would be in the choir room, which is just behind the sanctuary, where you could hear everything. And he would just sit in that choir room by himself, and he would hear the music and hear everything. You know, he wouldn't be necessarily singing songs or participating in that way, but just being physically present and yet absent at the same time was so important for him. And he would also come into our sanctuary, and we had a pipe organ. And I remember the first time I met him, I heard this beautiful organ playing, and I thought, you know, it's our organist practicing. And I get up there, and there's this guy in a tank top covered in tattoos, just playing the organ in this incredible way. And that was, you know, I guess his nonverbal way of worship. I mean, he was able to speak, but his anxiety was so high that he could not. That really wasn't a way for him to worship, and so just being physically present was important. I wanted to talk to you about your experience. I'm on medication as well. Actually, I think I take the same pill as you, I believe. And I remember when our children, especially our daughter, she was the first one to have to go on medication. And our first thought was, we failed. We thought we failed our daughter, that somehow she had to be on medication, even though we knew in our head that medication, we use medication for all kinds of other things that we would never even think about doubting. But at that moment, we thought, maybe if we had been better parents, she wouldn't have to go on medication. And then our, next child went on medication, and then our next child went on medication. And all of them have it at some point or another. Both my wife and I are on medication for mental health. And I don't know how to get beyond that. As a pastor and a chaplain, I try to encourage people, and I'll tell them, it's the same thing as taking, medication for diabetes or for seizures or whatever. But there's always in the back of our minds, I think, that doubt of, maybe if I worked harder, I'd be able to not have to have this medication. How do you respond to those kind of feelings? And do you still get those feelings at all?
Yeah. I don't really anymore. I did, for sure. And especially because for a long time, I had other people in my life who were on medication and psychotropic, whatever, medication for mental health supports. And I thought, well, my mental health isn't like, that's for people who have, extreme mental health. And so it was really humbling for me at first to be like, oh, oh, maybe I do need this. And but now, yeah, there's so much stigma about it. There's so much stigma. And I think it's really hard to fight back about that in a really, like, there's no pill to cure it, there's no simple thing to say, here's the answer to stigma. But I do think for me, one thing that's made a big difference is actually understanding a bit of neuroscience and like just learning some things about how the brain works, not even specific to depression, but just understanding how the brain works relative to various functions in the body. And realizing like, oh, like the brain does so many things. And why would there's like this one tiny piece that it's struggling with. Why would I blame it for that, right? Like, it's not even as if my whole brain is faulty. And even if it was, so what? But like, for me, it's right sizing it down to like, there's this one small part of my brain that's struggling. And the other thing for me that I often say, and I'm a big believer in normalizing things. So I'm very open about this. And I talk to a lot of folks who are either considering going on medication or have recently been diagnosed with depression. And I say something that the psychiatrist said to me. And they asked me if I wanted to go on medication. They said, you don't have to go on medication, it's your choice. And then they said, medication won't cure your depression. Medication will support your brain so that you have the space and the capacity to have strategies and to do the work of healing and all of these pieces. And so for me, it's not that medication isn't a cure for anything, but the medication is one way of supporting my brain. And if someone had a broken limb, we would never say you shouldn't have a cast for the first 8 weeks, right? And then some people may end up needing splints for longer, or some people end up needing surgery and they get metal in their arm. And we don't blame people for needing a metal piece in their arm. And so really for me, it's about neutralizing it in that sense of like, this is the same thing. My brain needs a little extra chemical. That's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, that's a good, definitely a good way to be looking at it. And I got to tell you that I envy you that you can see that sacramental side of the pill. I have enough, the way my brain works, I have enough trouble seeing the sacramental side of communion, to be honest. And now I understand that's part of my neurological makeup. That side of it, it's easier. It's not a theological thing for me that it's a memorial. It's more really hard for me to get myself to that place to see that. So I was moved by the way that you could experience God in those ways. So that's good.
Thank you. Well, I think it speaks to how diverse our experiences of the divine can be, right? And Amy mentioned other people having very different experiences, and I in no way would want my experience to be seen as prescriptive. And but for me, and coming back to this embodiedness that you talk about, for me it was a really tangible, embodied experience when so many other experiences around me were of loss and of suffering. To have even that little tiny bit of hope. And so, yeah, I'm very aware that there's no right or wrong around, I would say, experience of taking medication, and I am grateful for it. But it doesn't have to be that way for anyone.
Good.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing. We really appreciate it. And I was thinking, we were talking about medications in the podcast that we just recorded before this one too. And I was just thinking how important it is that we're just talking about this stuff and doing some normalization around, taking your meds, struggling, wanting to go off your meds, throwing up your meds, all these things that happen with our bodies. So thank you so much for sharing with our listeners. The last question that we always ask everybody is, how do you take care of yourself while you're doing this work, either academic work or pastoral work or wherever you find yourself? So Beth Anne, would you mind starting us off? What does soul care look like for you right now?
I often say I've had a spiritual director for the last 10 years, and I often say that's the single reason I would still consider myself a Christian. And that's been such an essential place for me to have somewhere where I can be totally honest. And I have been involved in church leadership and academia in various ways over the last decade. So I think often I tend to be hesitant to be honest in case I'm, shocking to others, or I don't want to distress others with my distress. And so having a spiritual director has been such a huge part of it for me. I also see a therapist regularly, which I'm particularly interested in psychospiritual integration and how psychotherapy and insights from psychology can influence spirituality and theology, the practices of those. So for me, it's been really important to have input from both places. And then nature is huge. Going out in nature makes such a big difference for me, and I'm not always good at it. I often will, when I'm having a hard day, collapse and have a nap instead. And then I often know if I went for a walk, this would feel different. If I went for a walk in the woods instead, that might be a less of a collapse and more of a self-care. And then being committed to delight, I think, has been something I've really worked on. That has made a big difference for me, is being committed to finding delight in the small things and in the daily things and in whatever it may be, that there's so much delight to be had in the world, and that's something I can cultivate in the midst of all the hard things.
Thanks so much. And what about you, Steve?
So in many ways, I seem to have the ideal life right at the moment, in that my wife and I are sharing a position. So I have less actual work hours than I've had in a long, long time. I'm done my DMin now after taking way too long to finish that. and I'm living in this beautiful rural place with lots of things to do, and my teenage children love to spend time with me, which is great. And so all of those things are wonderful, and I'm loving it. But I also, as I become more aware of what it means to be neurodivergent and to how my mind processes things, it seems very counterintuitive. But for me, the most the most life-giving thing is for me to come into the office, and it seems like so bizarre, and I struggle with it because it just doesn't make sense. And yet my wife will recognize when I'm struggling, and she'll say, all right, pack up your computer, go to the office, not because she wants to get rid of me, but because she knows that when I come to this place surrounded by my familiar books and have the opportunity to write something, or to record a podcast, or to record a video, or just to sit down with a book here without the high intensity emotions that are going on at home, that is the life-giving thing for me. And that's how I take care of myself, and how my wife takes care of me. And I'm just so thankful that she recognizes that. And even though, we have a new puppy at home, and she could use the help working with the puppy, and that she will send me off to have that time alone. I definitely need the other things, and I'm glad to get out into the trails with my kids. But I have, as a hardcore introvert, I need my alone time, or else I just can't function. So that's what I do. And I think I recognize too, maybe as much as I say I struggle to find something sacramental, but it is, to be in a church building, even when it's just me here, and to be in this place where worship takes place, I do feel close to God. I realize that the church is not a building, but the building is important too. So it's a good place for me to be at.
Thank you so much. I've found delight in this conversation today, so I'm really appreciative of both of you. We wanted to give you a chance for final thoughts before we sign off today. No pressure if you've said everything you wanted to say, but if you have something burning, now's your moment.
I'm just grateful for the chance to talk with the three of you. And like Amy said, so important to have these conversations and be normalizing that various levels of ability and disability, various levels of mental health experiences are present in our churches and our communities. And so to normalize it and to say, how does this work? How does this integrate with what it means to be in a community of faith is, I think, so vital. So thank you. And thank you, Steve, again, for sharing your story. It's, like I said, it's given me a lot to think about, and really helped remind me of the complexities of communication, and also sometimes the simplicity of it too.
Well, thank you. And this has been great to talk, and I just thinking about this conversation we're having, and the four of us, we all have four different stories, four different experiences, and that's really what the church is about. I think when it's at its best, when it's at its healthiest, is respecting that diversity, that we're all going to connect with God and connect with each other in different ways, and doesn't have to look exactly the same. And there's beauty in that diversity. And so I'm thankful for that. And I think tonight, when I have my Cipralex, maybe I'll think a little bit differently when I pop that pill after this conversation.
Thank you all.